All right, so this is episode 4 of the NYC Media Lab Open House. We are back at virtual 370 J Street, which, you know, I have to say, I'm getting a little comfortable in virtual 370 J Street. I still want to go back to real 370 J Street, and it sounds like maybe that'll be September, which seems like a long way away.
One day.
Yeah. Erica, let's just start by talking a little bit about the work that the Media Lab has done in the news space. So we did this event in January, and I thought it would be good for you to just talk a little bit about News Lab and what the goals were and how it turned out.
Yeah, in collaboration with the Knight Foundation, we actually brought in dozens of folks who work in local newsrooms, as well as technologists and university faculty and graduate students to brainstorm over the course of 2 days specific challenges and solutions to support local newsrooms, as well as potentially new emerging technologies that could support them. It was really fun. It was like a lot of brainstorming and cross sort of sector collaboration, which is always really cool to see. So yeah, it was a great event.
It was great, and it was nice to have people from all over the country attend. It wasn't just the little, New York East Coast news bubble, which I think was our goal at the outset, was to make sure we could get people to come in from all around the country, and in fact they did. So, which brings us to today's panel, and we are really lucky to have an esteemed and thoughtful and interesting group of people to join us today to answer what is, I think we all agree, a hard question, maybe the hard question. So the panel is titled Why News Matters, Exploring Journalism Solutions. And we brought in 3 terrific people, Craig Newmark of the Newmark Philanthropies, Vivian Schiller, who is, how long have you been at Aspen? Like short, right? Just arrived.
4 months.
Oh, there you go. Aspen Digital, and Jay Rosen from the NYU journalism program. And what I want to do, we're going to do this in 4 little quad split conversations. The first one is introduce the panel and ask each one of you a hard question. And these were not presented to you in advance. We considered sending you in advance. I went, nah, they're big boys and girls. The second is going to be the problem. What is the nub of the thing we're talking about? The third is going to be the president. And to be clear, we don't mean the president like we're going to talk about the election or politics, although I'm sure it'll come up, but more the role that he's played in what's happening in journalism and the whole enemy of the people drumbeat and how that is making problems more complicated. And then last but not least, the plan, which is what actions can we take? What things can we actually do to make things better? And even though we're putting that at the end, in some ways we think it's maybe the most important part. Okay, so to begin with hard questions, I thought I would start with Craig. So we've been together at enough events that I've heard you be asked versions of this questions many times. And I've always felt like your answer was charming and kind of amusingly evasive. So I thought I would ask it a different way. We're gonna get in a time machine and go back to 1995. It's a special year because it is the day Craigslist was founded, the year. And I would ask you, knowing what we know now, which is 25 some years later, would you do anything differently?
If in 1995 I had a clue as to what was going on, I would probably have tried to work with people trying to defend the country against the beginning of a dirty tricks operation designed to destroy the effectiveness of the Congress and of American national politics. But back then I was entirely naive, as opposed to just being mostly naive right now.
That's a good answer. And I think I might have joined you on that journey in 1995. So Vivian, you almost more than anyone I know have this career trajectory of being in interesting, complicated places in journalism. There's a little bit of a Zelig part of it, like there's a complicated thing happening and you're there, and there's another complicated. So
you wouldn't notice.
So when you look back and was there anything that you would do differently, particularly at NPR, given where we've ended up today?
Yes. Well, first of all, since we're in the truth telling, because this is about journalism, we're in the truth telling. I want to stay for the record. First of all, Craig is one of the least naive people I know. So that was just a flat out lie. What would I do differently? One of the things that at NPR that was really just, and this was, I was there 2008 to 12, I think, something like that. It's all a blur. And the threat to local journalism was only just beginning to emerge. And one of the things that we talked about, and in hindsight, I wish we had pushed harder on, is the collaboration between and among local NPR member stations who all operate independently and other local media. We did look at that a bit, but I feel in hindsight that if we had emphasized that more, that, I would like to believe that things might be a little bit better today, or maybe that's wishful thinking.
So Jay, you write incredibly provocative stuff. And I often find myself reading what you write and cheering, like literally, not making noise in the apartment, but, cheering like, he said it, that's great. And I wonder if your students read you, and if in their deeply, I don't know if they're honest about this, but if you could get into their psyche, like, do they buy this whole, the news business is in trouble conversation, or do they think, hey, get off my lawn, it's all news now, Vox is news, Reddit is news, yeah, it's hard now, but it's like, are they invested in this conversation about the dangers in the news business?
My students are all enrolled in a special program focused on innovation in journalism. And we start actually in 1995, when the digital era of journalism really began, when the major news sites went online. And from the very beginning, meaning literally the first day of class, they are engaged in thinking through and working on the problem of sustainability in journalism. And they're a little bit different than most journalism students who are being trained as, forgive the expression, content creators or storytellers. They are being trained to work at the intersection of technology, editorial, and business, where many of the hardest problems of sustainability and innovation are located. And if they are not interested in that, they wouldn't have enrolled in my program, which is called Studio 20, emphasizing the importance of making new things, making solutions. Contrary to what people on the right wing or the alt-right think when they encounter me on Twitter, I don't teach about Trump and the press and problems in political journalism. That's not the focus of my teaching. I'm interested in that as a writer, as a critic. That's part of my job. But another part of my job is preparing students to work in the seams of organizations that used to be able to separate editorial and business, and used to be able to think very rarely about technology. Now all of those things are crucial, and sustainability, how we going to support serious journalism, has moved to the front of all problems in journalism. So I'm trying to prepare them to work on those problems, and the group of students that we attract are really from around the world. And every year they become more focused on how are we going to have journalism in the future.
I'm sorry, I'm going to roll that back. You just said, how are we going to have journalism in the future?
Yeah, like how are we going to support serious public service journalism in the future? That is in doubt. It's unclear how that is going to happen in the future.
So Vivian, you were included in an article I think it was in The Guardian the other day, about the fact that PPP funds should not go to local newspapers. It kind of read like you were saying it, but it really wasn't you saying it. But there was definitely a question about the complications of federal government money going into journalism.
Yeah, I have pretty strong feelings about that.
So share them with us.
Yeah. Look, I understand that that journalism is. I agree with Jay. I think that we're at a tremendous period of risk where, you know, we've seen tens of thousands of journalists lose their jobs since the beginning of the pandemic, and it could become much worse. That said, journalism, in order for it to be, for it to mean anything, it has to be independent. And I get very concerned whenever there is government money in the mix. And, you know, when I've said this in the past, people remind me of postal subsidies and things like that. That's all fine. I am not concerned about government money where there is absolutely no human decision-making involved, that it can apply to a group or an entity automatically. As soon as you have individuals picking and choosing, or you have individuals whose jobs are predicated, individuals who give out government money and whose jobs are predicated on that government money continuing, and therefore they are concerned about how much journalism is rocking the boat, that's where you have a problem. So for example, my concerns are about CPB, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the discretion that they have, and the fact that they are political appointees and that their jobs, again, are predicated on Congress not ending funding for public media, which means that they are institutionally incentivized for journalism to not make Congress angry, for example. So any scenario that involves human decision-making about government funding to news organizations concerns me. Now, that said, I've seen some solutions that are, you know, that take that decision-making out of the equation. And again, I would point to postal subsidies, for example, the classic example, as not being problematic. But yeah, I think, you know, look, I'm not going to point to any news organization and say they shouldn't take relief money. But because this is a crisis, but it does concern me in the medium and long term.
Can I ask Vivian a question there?
Sure.
Vivian, would you say that your experience at NPR as CEO from 2008 to 2012 taught you that reliance on government funding can breed institutional caution?
Well, yes, but let me be really clear about what institutions I'm talking about. So there is sort of a meme out there for people that don't understand how quality newsrooms work, that in a newsroom, an individual editor or reporter will go, we can't report on that story because it's going to risk our funding. That look, I can only speak for NPR, but and I wasn't in the newsroom 24/7. I am 100% confident that conversation has never happened. Mm-hmm. That no editor and no reporter at NPR is saying, we're not going to report on wrongdoing because of our federal funding. It's the danger and the risk is much more subtle than that. In the case of my experience, when there were certain controversies, and we can, that's a whole other webinar for another time, but where the push and the anxiety came from was from, in this case, CPB, when people on the Hill were unhappy about some things NPR was reporting. NPR was reporting whatever it deemed newsworthy, but CPB was highly alarmed, and considering that they control funding to local public radio stations and they make discretionary decisions about other funding, and their role is contingent on continuous government funding, which was at that moment its threat. That's where the risk comes. It's from the people that give out the money. It's not from the journalists in the newsroom. I want to be super clear about that.
So let's talk about money. So we happen to have a very uniquely relevant person on this panel today, because Craig, you have put your money where your mouth is. You've invested in a lot of different kinds of journalistic enterprises. Part of what makes your collection of philanthropy interesting is that there isn't a straight through line. some of them are programs, some of them are issue oriented, some of them are publications. Like, is there some magic strategy behind what you're supporting, or is it like how? I mean, I started to make a list of all of the different $1 million here, $1 million. And it's like it's a long list.
Well, as you hear, the Corvid gods encourage me to to actually have some consistency among the institutions that I'm helping out. There's actually two lines here. The important one is to protect the country and to protect the election and voters. And the way a lot of that's done is by encouraging news outlets, whether they're original news institutions or news distribution outlets, to help fight against things like false equivalence or professional disinformation operations coming from whatever source. And here I'm most immediately inspired by Margaret Sullivan and Jay Rosen, which is to say, when you know a public figure is disinforming the public, if they're in fact lying to the public, do something about that. And I'm funding a lot of institutions focusing on that, including a number of areas, including the Columbia Journalism School, CUNY Journalism, NYU, and so on. But also I realized that in New York, well, New York is a news desert. So I figure I may as well support local journalism there. The places like The City, which is a new news publication, via WNYC, and their subsidiary effort, Gothamist, which I'm particularly impressed by via their Vermin beat, in which I also include the Mandarin duck as official vermin, even though it's disappeared, but I'm sure was delicious, particularly in a red curry sauce. I'm also supporting nationally local journalism via the Report for America and the American Journalism Project. I'm acting as an outsider, a dilettante. All these efforts are doing really good work, but the pointy end of the spear is on encouraging news distribution outlets to avoid false equivalence and to avoid promoting or amplifying disinformation.
We'll skip going back to the Mandarin duck deliciousness, just because we'll save that for another day. Let's move on to this next section and talk about the real nub of the problem. And I'm just going to put a sentence out there and let you guys have at it. Steve Bannon has famously said that the strategy for winning is flooding the zone with shit. Is that what's going on? Is it as simple as that?
He said more than that, Steve. He said first, the Democrats don't matter, which takes the strategy out of the realm of normal politics where you have two parties contending for votes and for the best ideas. The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, which is a second really interesting statement in which he's placing the Trump movement, the Trump government, as in opposition to the news media rather than opposing political opponents. He's defining journalists as the opponents. And the way to deal with that opponent, the media, is to flood the zone with shit. So you have to have all three propositions to understand what Bannon is saying. The Democrats don't matter. That's lifting the Trump movement out of normal politics. The real opposition is the media. He defines himself as governing against the news media and then flooding the zone with shit, which means endless lying, endless distraction, endless controversy, and so much to report on that any individual story shrinks into insignificance.
Can I add a piece on that?
Of course.
All of that, what he said, and on top of that, the other ramification of all of that, that flood of shit is in addition to just there being so much that you can't focus on any one thing. There's so much misinformation, so many lies that it causes, and it's coming at such velocity that the impact of that is to not know who to believe. And when you get confused and you don't know who to believe, you stop believing anything you see or anything you read in the media. Into that vacuum can enter an autocrat, any autocrat anywhere in the world, who can then say, you know what, I will make sense of the world for you. Just listen to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very important point Vivian made. And you could look at Steve Bannon's remark as revealing a demobilization strategy. It's an attempt to drive people from the political arena so that they don't pay attention, they don't act in the classical public sphere fashion of trying to inform yourself, develop an opinion, and then vote according to your understanding of your interests. The purpose of flooding the zone, the shit, is to make it difficult for people to figure out what's happening, to get them so frustrated that they believe anything, and to demobilize, meaning to drive people away from voting and paying attention.
Okay,
So Craig,
I agree with this in a really big way. A great deal of everything I do is to support the people contributing to the national defense against efforts like this. A related effort has to do with the harassment of journalists, particularly women journalists. A lot of people are helping out with that, and we're beginning to see the beginning of a unified effort.
A piece of tape out of Comac, Long Island from last week. I mean, I see a lot of chillingly scary stuff, and that still kind of ringed at 10.5 for me. It's like, because the journalists who were there, they were literally doing what I thought the protesters wanted, which was to be covered. And for somehow them to be turned on, and it did feel like it was going to become violent. It was terrifying. And we're seeing more and more of that. And in terms of women journalists, I found myself thinking the other day, you never hear anyone use the phrase nasty man. Nasty ... always has woman after it. So when Trump says that's a nasty question, the sexist nature of that accusation is not accidentally baked into it. But yet, very brave people go to work every day covering these stories. So, but I think that the risk that they're increasingly up against is very real. So when you say you're supporting those organizations, give us a tangible example of, so for example, you just made a commitment to the American Press Institute. How will they organize an effort to make the election coverage fair?
Well, the group which I feel represents the pointy end of the spear, and please remember I support a lot of vets organizations, so I've started to talk like them. The people in the vanguard, I think, are the International Women's Media Fund, and so I'm working with them to help me better understand all this, because I'm not really smart to lead. I'm too naive, as you know. There's also other groups like Equality Labs, Online SOS, who are helping out with this, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Reporters Committee, and so on. A lot of people doing really good work who I've helped fund, and I've actually lost control of how much I'm doing and so on. So that's why I'm getting them to help me out with this, much like I'm getting help from the American Press Institute regarding the Trusted Elections Network, getting help from Aspen Institute Digital regarding cybersecurity and disinformation work. The idea is to find people who are much smarter than me and much less naive.
I think it's important also, Steve, to be clear in our description of what this is. This is a hate movement against journalists. And it existed before Donald Trump skipped onto the political scene in 2015, but he has supercharged it. And we shouldn't mince words in describing it. It's a hate movement with journalists as the object the hate object. And that is central to the political movement that Trump has launched and sustained since his candidacy began in 2015.
I have a question regarding, I guess, the relationship between news, media, journalists, and culture. So I think the topics around gendered language and the violence surrounding it, I often find that news media can reinforce dangerous cultural stereotypes and tropes. But I also think media and journalism has a unique responsibility and a position to be able to shape and shift and change those cultures as we think about representation and we move forward and change those power paradigms. How do you think, I guess, adding a tech lens to this, what are some solutions or some exciting opportunities that you might see given the downsides of things like echo chambers and unregulated platforms and the ease with which people can create disinformation and use synthetic media?
I mean, I have to say, it's a problem. It's a problem that's been around for a very, very, very long time. But I want to point to a few things that give me hope. There is, in recent times, more and more reporting, more and more focus through the lens of women. Some of these are publications that have sprung up. One of them, actually, that Craig, thank you for, I have nothing to do with it, so I'm saying thank you on behalf of all of us as readers for supporting the 19th, which is a really fantastic new publication that looks at women in politics and is really quite extraordinary. There's some other new ventures that are launching. One of them is from Cindy Levy, who was the really quite storied editor-in-chief of Glamour, looking at women's issues. And there is also more effort from other mainstream news organizations to do more. I look at, I'm just picking at random the example of the New York Times going back through history to cover in classic New York Times fashion, obituary fashion, women that were not covered at the time. So I think there's a lot of really interesting work being done to help remedy what has been a centuries-long problem, which isn't to say there's not a lot farther to go.
I saw that obituaries piece. That was fascinating. I thought it was so cool. Mm-hmm.
It's ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
So Vivian, I have to ask, because you're in two interesting places in your career, and I think they talk to each other. So if you were today at NPR and you knew that Twitter was being this amplification tool of 100 tweets fired at Barack Obama when he gives this lovely talk on Saturday night, like, would you say to reporters,
more than 100?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would you say to your reporters, you know what, we don't have to amplify that? Like, could mainstream media not take the bait of every tweet that is put out?
Yes. Yes, mainstream media does not need to take the bait of every tweet that's put out. I mean, this is the problem we're seeing continuously. Like right now, the current real-time example is, Trump has invented something that he can't explain that he's calling Obamagate. Nobody even really knows exactly what it is. And so by amplifying, by even reporting, as many very, well-respected news organizations are about Trump's, demand for the most, so what he is alleging is, the most corrupt, criminal-laden, criminal event of 100 years that he can't even explain what it is. Why on earth should we amplify that? It's just more noise. Now, it doesn't mean, the usual response to that is, and I really want Jay to speak about this because this is what he's so good at talking about, but I'll just say one other thing. The usual response when you say, well, just don't report, just don't amplify it, is he's the president of the United States. It's really important for people to understand it. It's important for people to hear about it. If they think this is nuts, then so be it. That helps them form them as voters. But so the idea is not to pretend it never happened, but to deeply, deeply put it in context. And there are many techniques to do that. But can I throw it to Jay, because this is really his field.
I believe the phrase that I read somewhere was a truth sandwich.
Well,
I
truth
love
sandwich
that
is one.
phrase.
Yeah.
Yes.
Whose is that, Craig? I'm trying to remember now. I know.
It was George Lakoff originally, but the pioneers appear to be Margaret Sullivan and Jay Rosen.
Yeah.
So Jay, does a truth sandwich solve our problem?
It's not a solution. It's a suggestion for better practice. So Truth Sandwich was developed from a suggestion by George Lakoff, and he was reacting in part to the fact that first impressions are very powerful, and the first speaker of the lie kind of has an advantage over those who come later and try and debunk it. And so he came up with this method called, which Brian Stelter later gave the name Truth Sandwich to, in which you first state what is true, then you report that a dubious or false claim has been made, and then you restate what is true, so that the first impression and the last impression are of the true thing, and in the middle you have the problematic statement. And so using events of this week, it might read something like, there's no evidence that this magic drug Trump calls about has any prophylactic effect on the coronavirus. But the president said he's taking it. We couldn't confirm it with his doctor, and other experts say it could be dangerous to take this drug. So there you have the truth anchoring the statement, you have the truth exiting the statement, and then you have the lie or the problematic or dubious claim in the middle. So that's the idea of a truth sandwich. But I think part of the reason that we're in this dilemma of reporting these crazy statements that the president makes and allowing that to kind of like fill up the news agenda is we have this very old premise or practice in which what the president says is defined as news. What the president says is news by definition. And this is a very old attitude in American journalism that has existed for a long time. And it's one of those things that he broke. So like there's many other assumptions and norms that the president has broken. And when he breaks these assumptions, the practices that are built on top of them also break. And so that is one of them. You can't just assume that because the president says it, it's news. You have to apply independent judgment. But where does that independent judgment come from? If you think of yourself as just passing along what others do, then you kind of have no basis for deciding this is news and that isn't news. And so the phenomena of Donald Trump as like a hurricane of lies is forcing journalists, I think, into a more searching look at what priorities and values, what kind of country they're willing to uphold, and what kind of country they're letting us become by not using their judgment more often.
But just the only thing I'll say back to that is there, the famous Les Moonves quote about Donald Trump, which is he might be bad for America, but he's good for CBS. I mean, to some extent, Donald Trump is good for the news business in the sense that he makes a lot of news. And
yes,
he might, anytime he's on TV, he might say something really shocking or terrible, or he might, there is a certain grippingness to his act that grows exhausting but not old. And I think I get your suggestion that the answer is to not report it all, but I think in real life, I mean, Vivian, maybe this is, if you were in a newsroom today and you had the ability to somehow dial down, I can think of 100 things that I wish were being covered more. I wish what was happening in Health and Human Services was being covered more. I wish the Ed Department was being covered more. There's a whole series of other things going on in Washington that I'm sure are equally important and complicated that get lost. And Jay, you've talked about this too, which is there's limited room for the headlines. And so, Trump owns them every day. But is there is there a way that, Vivian, you could tell your news team, your organization, we're going to dial this down?
I think dial down is maybe not the right expression. And partly this is not new. This is not, I mean, Trump, as in all things, Trump is an exaggeration of things that have long existed. And there's long been a tension between, even in campaigns, reporting on the horse race versus giving voters the information they need to make good decisions, right? So it's just now become more exacerbated, and maybe it's more acute because right now we're in a situation where people's lives and livelihoods are at stake like never before. So yeah, I mean the decision, I'm not in a newsroom, but would always have to be, how do we give people the information they need to protect their health, protect their family, to make good decisions in their communities, to understand what their financial future is going to be, and what information do they need in order to make decisions about who they're going to vote for. So, which is not the same as the minute to minute, what crazy thing did Trump say today?
I'd argue that the people in charge of news distribution platforms, whether the newspapers or social media platforms, they know that they need to deal with this. They know what the right thing to do is, because they have their direct reports telling them that. The people who run these distribution centers just need some cover because they're afraid to do the right thing, justifiably so. I'm not very smart, and as you know, I'm very naive. So all I know how to do is work back channels and encourage them to not only stand up for what they know is right, but to help protect each other for when they make that move. I don't know if that'll ever succeed, but the deal is that I'm not going to stop encouraging them.
Craig mentioned distribution centers for news, and I wanted to know what he was talking about. Are you talking about the tech platforms, or are you talking about news companies?
Publishers.
Good question, Jay. Both.
Well, with
Okay.
with the platforms, we're talking about curation or moderation of content that's coming either from publishers or from users or being shared by users. Obviously, the publishers are making editorial decisions. Both of them have a lot of hard decisions on their hands. One thing that came up this morning, I mean, I'm just, look, any day of the week we could pick a million examples, but so today being like every other day, today Trump tweeted about the absentee ballots that went to every voter in Michigan. He said in the tweet, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have it in front of us. First of all, he mixed up the fact that these were absentee ballot applications, that were going to voters, not actual ballots. That's number one. But aside from that, he implied that this was some corrupt act and that it might be within his power to withhold state funding. So, there were a number of people now talking about the decisions that platforms make. There were a number of people on Twitter who pointed out to, Jack Dorsey, among others, that this is a direct violation of their terms of service in terms of not putting out misinformation about voting. And what are they going to do about it? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, we've seen things like this happen every day, across multiple platforms, and it's very vexing. And it gets to that same issue of, are you really going to delete a tweet from the president of the United States? Mm-hmm. I ask that rhetorically.
Yeah. No, I found myself the other day doing something, just as I was thinking about these issues, I found myself researching and writing down the names of all the board members at Twitter. And realized that I knew none of them. Never heard of the names I'd never heard of, people I'd never heard of, not big Silicon Valley heavy hitter names, but literally some bankers, some VCs, but thought maybe that we need to broaden the conversation because maybe Jack's not getting the message. All right, so let's move on to chapter 4. We're going to solve this problem today. That's my goal. I set out to do it. And much like the president, when I say we're going to solve COVID-19 before November, we're just going to do it. So let's talk about solutions, and I know, Jay, you have a couple of rather specific ideas that you proposed.
Well, one thing I think would be very valuable is if news organizations took it upon themselves to make part of their mission preventing the president from misinforming the American public. Just that alone, if they just took that on as one of their goals, one part of their mission, prevent the president from misinforming the public about, for example, the virus and how to combat it, that itself would have huge effects. But I have to say this carefully. You can't keep from getting sucked into Trump's agenda and his hurricane of lies without having a firm grasp on an agenda of your own. And I think as we get into the campaign season, it becomes more and more important for journalists and newsrooms to figure out what they are trying to accomplish with their political coverage. Because if they don't know that, then they are simply open to getting maneuvered and pushed around by each gale and storm of controversy that the president and his allies decide to create. And what I mean by an agenda is not a particular political result or affecting the outcome of the election or improving one candidate's chances and undermining another. I mean an agenda for the public. What is it they're determined to create for the public? And this is why I have pleaded with the press to take up an old idea in American journalism, the citizens' agenda model of election coverage, in which first you go to the public and you ask the people you're trying to inform, what do you want the candidates to be discussing in a serious way as they compete for votes? What are the things you want the campaign dialogue to be about? What are the problems you want the campaign and the candidates and the media to focus on? And after asking enough people and getting a strong sense of what that agenda is, you then can use that agenda to shape your coverage. And that's what you can use to keep coming back to and to ground your journalism so that when one of these storms comes by, you don't get blown off course. That's called the Citizens Agenda Model for Campaign Coverage. It's been around since the 90s, pre-web. It's an alternative way of organizing election coverage. But until we have newsrooms that are willing to kind of hold to a mission that they have for their political coverage, they're going to continue to get blown about and manipulated by this president.
Vivian, what's Aspen doing? What solutions are on your agenda?
Well, I mean, our role in the world is not necessarily, I mean, we're not a media company, we're not a tech company. So I see our role and the role of my group is our remit is across news media and technology, and the intersection between across those two is to try to convene people in every which way we can in order to drive towards change and action. So we're doing a lot of work in this area. We're doing both a lot of public webinars, we're doing public programs, we're doing a lot of private meetings, bringing people together. We're working on content moderation right now, bringing sort of thought leaders together with policymakers, together with tech companies. We're doing that the same with, across a lot of, things around deep fakes, you name it. So that is our goal. Our ultimate goal is to help, the policymakers, companies, civic organizations, and citizens be responsible stewards of media and technology, for the betterment of society. So that's what our role is.
Craig, is there something out there that you're like, I wish I could find someone doing this?
I think I've already found people doing a great deal of it. Um, right now, Jay's doing a lot of it. Margaret Sullivan is, and Aspen Digital is doing a great deal of it. So are a lot of people in New York at the Columbia J School, at CUNY Journalism, Data and Society, and frankly, different parts of NYU. I've actually lost track of how people who are doing it, so I'm getting help in that regards. The extra part, the hard part for me has been finding people who are the people who run newspapers and social media platforms, finding them who the CEOs listen to, and then working with them to have to get their voices heard beyond just humoring them. And that's what's in process. This is quiet back channel diplomacy, which is not my strength, speaking as a nerd, and of course, someone who's kind of naive about it. But these things are happening. Wrapping up a great deal of this are the folks at the American Press Institute running the Trusted Elections Network, like Andrew Rockway and Tom Rosenstiel. The idea is just to keep people going, to encourage them, to cheer them on, and to remind them that this has happened before. We're in a place who a guy who could write good did so and just never stopped. This guy named Thomas Paine. And the idea is to support folks in that spirit and then just to keep supporting them and never stop.
Jay, you shared with me that there's an idea to not have the editorial agenda be driven by a clock, and that things that were important should be stacked differently than it happened than recency. Explain how that would work.
Well, one of the problems we have with coverage of the pandemic is there's a mismatch between the clock or the internal sense of time that journalists use in covering a story like this and the progress of the pandemic itself. And so over time, journalists have slipped into thinking of their role as content production, and they're focused on what's new today, what the story of the day is or the surprise of the day is. But creating public understanding around the pandemic isn't like that. Things that are true today about the pandemic are going to be true next week as well. And so there's a mismatch between the rhythms of the newsroom, in which one set of information is replaced the next day by new information, and the actual facts of the pandemic, which are changing but slowly. And there are other kinds of conflicts too, between the way the pandemic progresses and the way news works. So for example, as we learn more, our advice might change for people. That's the logic of the pandemic. But if the advice changes, that's in journalism, that's kind of like a flip-flop, or that's sort of a reason for controversy. And so this crisis is challenging all sorts of sort of common sense routines in journalism. And so one of the things I suggested, it's kind of a minor suggestion, is an urgency index in which journalists try to tell us what the most urgent things we should be paying attention to are every day, not the newest things, but the things that remain urgent. What you could look at is not what's true today, but what's still true. And that's not what news has traditionally been built to do, but the challenge of this crisis might require forms of journalism that we don't have yet. So that's what I was trying to do with that little suggestion of an urgency index. What's urgent, what we should most understand and focus on about the pandemic has been testing for like 3 to 4, or maybe even longer, maybe like 10 weeks. Testing has been the most important thing for the United States to try and catch up with. It's not new, but it's still important. So that's what I was trying to get at there.
All right, last question, because we're running out of time. I'm working hard to curate or recurate the information that I digest, that I listen to, that I read. And so I would ask each of you, if you could, to share one thing that's a little off the beaten path, either a podcast you listen to or a publication you read or a book that's really been interesting, something that's made your brain go in an interesting place and that isn't one of the big media sources we all know.
Well, I would start with an individual, Ed Yong, W-O-N-G, a writer for The Atlantic. His work, which is all about trying to understand the pandemic, has been so incredibly valuable to me. And he is like my lifesaver. I feel like he is keeping me on top of this story. He's got great sources, but he talks to all kinds of people. And he doesn't present himself as an expert himself, but as an explainer. And I just think if you simply follow him and his work, you're going to get on the right side of this enormous crisis.
Good, thank you.
My escape is fiction novels. I have a long list of books that friends have written that people are like, oh, this is going to explain everything. I can't. I need to escape to fiction. So I've been just binge reading novels and, of course, binge watching great TV too.
Fiction. Craig?
What's influenced me has been, aside from the sources that I've mentioned already on this, is the podcast from Preet Bharara, Stay Tuned, because that kind of concise analytical legal perspective is pretty handy, and it's fairly unique in its voice. He gets to the point and does it very well in a manner that I appreciate, and that's kind of unique. It's either him or Chuck Rhodes.
Thank you all very much. On behalf of the team at the NYC Media Lab, you've been generous with your time, thoughtful and interesting, and I love those suggestions at the end. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon.
Bye, thanks.